On Looking and Looking Again by Richard Miller and Anne Jurecic. Pay attention! Walk the hallways of any elementary school, and it won't be long before you hear this exasperated command. Over time, all students learn that what their teachers mean when they say, pay attention, is sit still and be quiet. The teachers know, of course, that there's more to paying attention than being quiet. But what that more turns out to be is something that can't be ordered into existence by figures of authority. So students learn early on how to get their bodies to behave in class, but getting their minds to behave is another matter. The paradox at the beginning of the process of paying attention seems irresolvable. How does mental focus emerge out of chaos? The attentive mind out of the distracted mind? How does anyone ever learn to pay attention when the mind's preference is to drift, to wander, to surf? Our answer is by practice. But how does one practice a state of mind? The poet William Blake offers some guidance on how to think about this paradox in the opening stanza of his poem, Auguries of Innocence. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. On a first reading, Blake's stanza seems to offer a straightforward proposition about how to trigger a state of deep attentiveness. If you want X, to see the world in a grain of sand, then do Y, hold infinity in the palm of your hand. But if this is what it takes to pay attention, attentiveness of the kind Blake describes seems to be an impossibility. For how is one supposed to go about grabbing hold of infinity or experiencing eternity in an hour? Perhaps we've misread the stanza. Perhaps Blake is making a statement both about what paying attention involves and what it makes possible. To see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower is to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Read this way, Blake's verse is saying that if you can learn to see a world in a grain of sand or a heaven in a wildflower, then you can gain access to realms beyond what you know and even beyond the limits of thought. You can reach the infinite and the eternal. From Blake's poem, we could conclude that the practice of writing poetry has trained Blake's mind to focus on the particular, a grain of sand, a wildflower, until it leads to something much bigger, a world, a heaven, and onward to realms beyond measure, infinity, eternity. More generally, we can say that Blake shows us that the attentive mind generates insights, connections, and beautiful objects, and moves by inference, analogy, and metaphor. Does this mean that instead of commanding a distracted student to pay attention, teachers should try saying, sit still and be a poet? That command wouldn't work any better than the command to pay attention, of course. First, even the best poet can't be a poet on command. And second, poetry is only one possible result of paying attention. Better by far, we think, to say, practice looking and looking again. A teacher we greatly admire, Anne Berthoff, developed an exercise that we've adapted here to help you experience the kind of seeing Blake describes. To get her students to re-see the natural world, Berthoff would bring to class all manner of organic objects, a starfish, the husk of a cactus, dried reeds, a pressed flower, and then have each student take one of the objects home to study for a week. For our version of this exercise, you'll need to select your own organic object, Anything from the natural world will do. You should choose something that you can hold in your hand and that you can put somewhere out of harm's way for a week. We ask that for 7 straight days, you spend at least 10 minutes recording your observations of the object you've selected. Here's an example of what a day's entry might look like, written by our student Eric Rose on day 5. Clearly, the plant is dehydrated and dying, and yet, besides my dismembering it of its limbs, it still has the same form and design as it did when I first took it home. The colors of the leaves have noticeably changed, but nothing else has visibly changed as far as I can tell. Of course, the way I'm seeing this object has changed since the first day I laid my eyes upon it. There are definitely patterns that are quite unmistakable in and on this plant. For instance, the many stems that connect the buds to the stem that connects back to the entire organism. There are 7 of these mini stems, and they are all about of equal length. That is interesting. If it is sunlight the buds seek, I would think that maybe one of the mini branches would push itself considerably farther out so as to receive more energy for its own survival. But naturally, these buds are probably not competing for energy, but rather are working together for the survival and health of the entire plant. I cannot help but draw a connection to a human body here. You can find multifacets and numerous parts and functions of parts within a single limb of a body. In fact, you can find it in one single human cell. I'm reminded of a quote from Aldous Huxley, who is quoting from William Blake. "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it truly is, infinite." A person is not just a person with a name, a height and a weight, and a social status. Each person is also composed of electricity, of a billion cells that perform who knows how many functions. My plant here, at first glance, is just a little piece of a shrub. But if you really look at it, there's a lot going on here that makes this plant what it is. Can the physical world ever be described as infinite? Do we really actually know, in an empirical sense, of anything that is infinite? Why do we have a word describing something that we have never experienced? Is that evidence or a suggestion from our subconscious mind, our inner spirit, our unseen self, that there is such a thing as infinity? Is there infinity present in my little piece of shrub? I don't know, but I'm willing to bet that as more powerful microscopes are developed, there will surely be more we will be able to see in the physical universe around us. And this will further lend credence to the idea that, yes, with a necessary perspective, it may be possible to hold infinity in the palm of your hand. You won't know it unless you have eyes to see it or to take time to meditate on it, and even then, infinity is a tough thing to swallow and ascribe to what we can perceive with our 5 senses. But it's not impossible. Focusing on the plant stem, Eric makes connections to the human body, to a quote he's read in Aldous Huxley, and then back to the Blake poem we used in our writing prompt. Looking closely allows Eric to see beyond the plant back into his own mind. Thinking about how the plant is organized becomes, in this instance, a way to think about how all minds organize perceptions.